Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the absolute most haunting and frankly misunderstood practices in human history, Sati. We're going to completely separate the harsh historical realities from the persistent myths. We'll trace how this deeply entrenched custom actually evolved, and finally, uncover the incredible, multi-layered movement that brought it down.
Okay, let's kick things off with a number that might completely shock you. 1987. Seriously, when we think about historical practices like widow burning, we usually picture them happening centuries, maybe even millennia ago, right? But the last widely reported case of Sati took place in modern, independent India, just over 3 decades ago.
Just think about that for a second. It was September 1987 in the village of Dairala, Rajasthan. An 18-year-old woman named Roop Kanwar was burned alive on the funeral pyre of her husband, a man she had been married to for barely 8 months. And what's truly terrifying here is that a crowd of thousands watched it happen. Nobody stepped in. In the days that followed, they even built a glorified makeshift shrine right at the site, which literally drew hundreds of thousands of visitors. Now, thankfully, this horrific event sparked massive nationwide outrage. It threw a really harsh spotlight on how these archaic beliefs can somehow survive in modern times, and it ultimately forced the government to take severe legal action.
That brings us to Section 1, Myth versus Scriptural Reality, separating faith from forced immolation. To understand how a tragedy like that could even happen in 1987, we really need to question where this practice came from. Was it actually mandated by Hindu scriptures, like so many of its defenders falsely claimed? Well, let's start with the word itself. Sati actually comes from the Sanskrit word asti, which translates to a truthful, loyal, and ideal wife. If you look at the mythology, Sati was the name of goddess Uma, the first wife of Lord Shiva. The legend goes that when her father insulted Lord Shiva, she self-immolated in a fire out of pure anger. But, and this is a massive but, she did this while Lord Shiva was still alive. It totally contradicts the entire core requirement of the historical practice of Sati, which absolutely required the death of the husband. And this just brilliantly illustrates the massive disconnect between myth and reality here. For centuries, society pushed the narrative that this was a strict religious duty. But when you actually read the foundational texts, we're talking the Rig Veda, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, there is literally no explicit command forcing widows to burn themselves. Nothing. Even the Manusmriti, which gets heavily criticized for its really strict rules on women, only suggests lifelong celibacy and asceticism for widows. It never says anything about self-immolation. So, you're probably wondering, how did everyone get so convinced it was in the scriptures honestly? Honestly, deliberate manipulation. For example, there's a specific verse in the ancient Rig Veda that actually encourages a widow to go forward with her life. The Sanskrit word used is agre. But during the medieval period, certain priests intentionally twisted agre into agne, which means fire. Just like that, by swapping out a single letter, they completely falsely portrayed widow burning as this sacred Vedic tradition. It was a massive linguistic deceit, and it wasn't exposed until much later by scholars like Max Mueller. All right, moving into Section 2, the historical rise, tracing the timeline of an evolving practice. Let's step completely away from the myths for a minute and look at the actual historical emergence of this practice, using hard, documented evidence.
If you look at the first 1,000 years of Indian history, including the Mauryan Empire and the whole rise of Buddhism, Sati is basically a ghost in the records. It's just not there. The absolute earliest concrete inscription we found dates to 464 CE over in Nepal. Down in India, the earliest documented proof is from 510 CE in Madhya Pradesh, where a local ruler's wife died on his pyre. As we walk through the timeline, you start seeing it pop up in the 10th century among the royals of the Chola Empire in the south. By the 14th century, you've got foreign travelers like Ibn Battuta writing down eyewitness accounts. So it's slowly mutated from this weird, isolated royal anomaly into a much broader societal practice.
But things took a dramatic, incredibly dark turn with the onset of medieval Islamic invasions. As these foreign armies swept in, Rajput queens and royal women were staring down the terrifying prospect of captivity, enslavement, and mass sexual assault if their kings fell in battle. So to protect their honor, they resorted to jauhar, which is mass self-immolation. We see this with Rani Bai back in 711 CE, during the first Islamic attack by Muhammad bin Qasim, and then very famously with Rani Padmini in 1303 CE when Alauddin Khilji attacked Chittagore. The tragedy here is that over time, this desperate, horrifying wartime sacrifice got dangerously romanticized. It blurred the lines with Sati and spread this toxic idea that a woman's ultimate virtue was somehow tied to a fiery death.
Let's move to Section 3, the core cause, patriarchy.
the unequal burden of sacrifice. You see, when the wars eventually subsided, the practice didn't vanish. It actually grew. And to grasp why, we have to shift our lens from historical invasions to the systemic patriarchy and the deeply cynical economic motives that force this fate onto everyday common widows.
The stark, undeniable inequality of the era is laid out perfectly right here. If a wife died, the widower, he kept his authority, inherited the wealth, and was fully expected to remarry. No one asked him to sacrifice a thing. But if the husband died, an upper caste widow faced instant, complete isolation. She was strictly banned from remarrying and was suddenly completely economically vulnerable. In places like Bengal, where women actually did have some legal inheritance rights, greedy relatives would literally force a widow onto the pyre just so they could steal her property. They packaged it and sold it as a spiritual duty, but behind the curtain, it was entirely about patriarchal control and financial greed.
Which brings us to Section 4, the fight for abolition. A combined movement against the flames. The most crucial takeaway here is how this deeply entrenched, socially enforced nightmare was finally taken down. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't overnight. It was a fierce, multi-layered reform movement.
Now, you've got to know that opposition to Sati wasn't some brand new 19th century invention. Lots of rulers had tried to put a stop to it before. Muhammad bin Tughlaq was actually the first Muslim ruler to try banning it. Emperor Akbar offered gifts and land to talk widows out of getting on the pyre. Legendary leaders like Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj personally intervened to stop his own mother from committing Sati. And spiritual leaders like Sikh Guru Amar Das Ji actively preached against it. But while these were noble efforts, they just couldn't break the overwhelming, suffocating tide of orthodox social pressure.
Ultimately, successfully abolishing Sati required three major pillars working in tandem: Indian reformers, led by Raja Ram Mohan Roy, the British administration, who held the legal authority, and, crucially, foreign Christian missionaries like William Carey. And here's a really fascinating historical dynamic. We often heavily criticize foreign missionaries today, and sometimes rightly so, for their conversion motives, but in this context, they were actually a vital root force in helping eradicate this evil practice. They meticulously documented the horrors, they raised global awareness, and they stood firmly behind the Indian reformers to help enlighten the masses and guide society away from these superstitious killings.
For Raja Ram Mohan Roy, this wasn't just an intellectual debate. It was deeply, painfully personal. In 1811, his beloved older brother passed away. To Roy's absolute horror, his own family forcibly dragged his sister-in-law to the funeral pyre and burned her alive. The sheer trauma of watching her die ignited a lifelong crusade in him. He quit his job, dove headfirst into ancient scriptures, and started churning out pamphlets proving, definitively, that Sati was a manufactured social evil, not a religious duty.
And honestly, his work came not a moment too soon. When you look at the colonial administrative records, combined with the tireless surveys done by those missionaries, they revealed a statistic that is just staggering. Between 1815 and 1824, in the Bengal presidency alone, over 6,000 women were burned. 6,000! It was an absolute epidemic of socially sanctioned murder, and the pressure on the government to finally do something reached a complete boiling point.
So finally, all these efforts collided. The Indian reformers, the activist missionaries, and progressive officials pushed for decisive action. Governor General Lord William Bentinck stepped up, declared the practice a dark stain on humanity, and officially passed Regulation 17 on December 4, 1829. This was a landmark law. It banned Sati entirely, making it illegal and punishable as culpable homicide, regardless of whether anyone claimed the act was quote-unquote voluntary.
Of course, whenever there's progress, there's pushback, right? Orthodox groups were absolutely furious. They immediately framed the ban as an attack on their religion. They even gathered thousands of signatures and sent a massive petition all the way to the Privy Council in London, trying to get the law completely overturned. But Raja Ram Mohan Roy wasn't about to let his life's work get erased. He actually traveled to England himself, passionately defended the abolition in front of the highest courts, and in 1832 the ban was permanently, successfully upheld.
Finally, we reach Section 5, the shadow of Sati, the legacy of reform and the lingering echoes of patriarchy. As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to look at the shadow Sati still casts on our world today. The legal ban was this monumental victory, for sure, but it was really just the first step in tearing down the underlying structures that ever made it possible.
You see, just keeping these women alive wasn't going to be enough if their lives were still completely defined by misery and isolation. So that 1829 ban paved the way for the next logical step, the Hindu Widow Remarriage Act of 1856. Championed by reformers like Ishwar Chandra Vidyasarg, it finally gave widows the legal right to start over. And yet, as we saw at the very beginning of this whole timeline with the tragic death of Rup Kanwar in 1987, the dangerous glorification of this act still lingered. That modern tragedy forced India to enact the Commission of Sati Prevention Act, which created incredibly strict punishments not just for committing the act, but for anyone who even dares to glorify it or build shrines to it.
So, the reformers won. The physical fires of Sati have, thankfully, been extinguished, but it leaves us with this huge, critical thought to ponder. If a society was capable of convincing itself for centuries that burning women alive was somehow a sacred, noble act, in what other subtle, everyday ways do we still allow archaic, patriarchal beliefs to dictate women's lives today? The laws have definitely changed, but the work of reforming our mindset? That's an ongoing journey. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.